So this is my first time in New York. I've never been here before. I'm really excited that we had, New York style pizza over there. I'm just making fun. It was fine. It was good pizza. So again, my name is Ben Lesh. I am the lead author of RxJS. I'm now on the Angular core team as of like 8 months ago or so. I'm not the creator of RxJS. Some people have said that. Matt Podbosecki is a guy that created, he's actually in New York. He works in New York, that created RxJS while he was working at Microsoft. It's pretty much a straight port of, or it was pretty much a straight port of rx.net. And so some of the things that you find today in the version that I work on are still kind of relics from that past. So let me get over to my set of slides here. Actually, I originally was going to start off with live coding and observable. I think I'm going to do that for the second part. First off, and it's going to be really hard for me to see, but I'm just going to try to rough estimate from like the group in the front that I can actually see through this. Like, how many folks here are actively using RxJS today? A lot of people. So I'm going to assume that there's a general understanding of RxJS, but I'm going to try to go over just really quick generally what RxJS is and get people excited about it. How many people here think RxJS sucks or is really difficult? You're not going to hurt my feelings. Oh, you just don't like raising your hands. That's fine. That's fine. My feelings are hurt that you didn't raise your hands. So I'm actually going to start off with adding features to an existing Angular app. This is a talk that maybe you might have seen me do before. I'm doing again just because a lot of people have not seen this talk yet. I want to get people excited about it, and you have an opportunity to ask me questions about it afterwards. So loading. Come on, Google. There we go. All right. So complex features made easy with RxJS. And easy, I should have put in quotation marks because it's easy if you know RxJS. If you don't, then it's hard. I know it's hard. Again, I already went over this. So the question of like what is RxJS comes up a lot. And some people even think they know what it is, sometimes are a little off about it. So I want to give a quick primer on what RxJS is. Observables are the main focus of RxJS. We have this type called observables. And what they are is they're essentially sets of events. So they give you 0 to many values over time. And they can last any amount of time. They're cancelable, which makes them different from other primitives like, say, promises. And they're lazy, which is a key difference between them and promises. So when I say lazy, like a function is lazy. A function does nothing until you actually call the function, right? Observables are the same way. They don't do anything until you call subscribe. So again, they require subscription. If I have an observable, some observable, and frequently you'll see this $ at the end, and so through a lot of my code here, you'll see $ on the end of the observable just so you can identify which variables are observables. We don't actually do this inside of Google. Google has style rules that they don't want this in their TypeScript, but I am on the fence. I don't care one way or the other. I think it's helpful for a lot of people. But again, generally what happens is when you get an observable, you subscribe to it. And usually people end up subscribing with one callback, and that callback gets called every single time you get a new value from whatever's producing data inside the observable. There's a second callback that you can provide, which is the error callback. So a weird little known fact about this is if you provide an error callback, RxJS assumes that you're handling errors. If you don't provide it, RxJS provides default error handling, which just says, hey, you didn't handle this, so I'm going to throw it on a new stack. And then you can catch it in like window on error or process on error in Node. And then there's a final call, which generally it doesn't get used a lot in application code, but it gets used a lot inside of RxJS, the library, which is this is a completion callback. So this says, hey, I'm done producing values. I'm no longer giving them to you. So this is kind of the end of your set of values over time. Gives you the ability to cancel. So when you subscribe, you get this subscription back, which is this cancellation semantic. And later on, you can call unsubscribe on it, which is your code saying, hey, I no longer care about the values you're sending to me. Please stop. And that signals some teardown under the hood, which is an actual solid benefit of Rx. But the most important thing to know is observables push values. So you subscribe to them, and they push values over time. And I keep talking about how they're collections or sets of things. The reason that this is key is it enables us to do some really interesting stuff. We have operations you can perform on sets of things. And this is just a universal truth about, like, it's a truth of the universe, right? If I have a set of apples, I can make a set of apple pies. Well, I'd need more sets of other things. I can combine those sets and make a set of apple pies, right? If I have an array of numbers, I can transform that with map into an array of strings if I want, or an array of other numbers. So there's transformations. You can whittle your array of numbers down to smaller things. You can do the same thing with apples or observables or whatever. If you have a set of things, you can filter them, you can transform them, you can combine them in different ways, you can run accumulations on them like a reducer or that sort of thing. If you walk away with nothing, if you walk away and say, RxJS still sucks, that's fine, but this is true about sets of things no matter where you are in life, even if you're not programming. So it's something to know. Flattening, by the way, is the act of, say, if you have an array of arrays, you can flatten it to a single array. You can do that with sets of things as well, at least with most sets of things, provided they have the right properties. And observables, you can flatten an observable of observables into a single observable of values. So again, arrays are collections. You can do this with arrays. You've got filter, map, and reduce exist on native arrays. Some people don't know this, but you can take an array of numbers, you can filter it and say, give me all the numbers that are greater than 4, double them, and then sum them with you. That's what reduce is doing at the bottom. Observables, you can do exactly the same thing. So I can say from that same array and then pipe it through our operators from RxJS. And they've got the same names, they do exactly the same thing. The only difference is you have to subscribe to it because it returns an observable, and observables don't do anything unless you subscribe. So they also, unlike arrays, they have this element of time, right? So there's different operations you can perform on an observable that you couldn't really perform on an array. For example, you can debounce them, right? Like, so you can say, I have an observable, and I want to make a new observable that only emits values that have come through with this specified kind of time period to keep it from spamming me too much. You can throttle, it's the same sort of idea. You can delay the values from getting to you. You can race two observables against each other, and whichever one emits first wins, and you kill the other one and keep that one. There's a variety of things. There's a lot of different things. And that's one of the reasons why when you go and you look at the RxJS API, you're like, oh my God, there's 60 plus operators here. What do I use? It's because there's a lot more things you can do with this primitive. So as an example of something you might do with RxJS, you can do a basic drag and drop. So this is just saying, give me an observable of mouse downs, and whenever there's a mouse down event, I want to map that into all the mouse move events, but only take those until there's a mouse up event. So exhaust map is this operator that just says, hey, map to this new observable and give me all the values of it until it completes. And I don't care if another value comes in and you try to map to a new observable. It's like the opposite of switch map if you're familiar with switch map in RxJS. So a save button, you can't double submit. This has been an ongoing thing for pretty much as long as I've been doing web development. You don't want somebody submitting their credit card information twice or adding multiple records, so people like gray out the submit button or whatever. You could just use Rx to do something like that. So it's the same with the exhaust map. You just say every time someone clicks save, I want you to post the data, but I'm using exhaust map, so every other click to save just gets dropped until that posted data comes back. So that's another use case for this operator. The throttled auto suggests this is like the idiomatic example that people do in RxJS all the time. So you take text input changes, so every time the value changes in an input, and we're saying debounce it by half a second. So what it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, if you type a bunch of keys within a half second of the last key pressed, I want you to ignore all that, wait for a half a second, and if you haven't hit anything else, then take the value and go on to the next step, which is going to do our get to get our search data, wait for it to come back, and give us the results. So this, I mean, it does it all in roughly a line or two of code, depending on how you format it. But writing this just with imperative code is actually non-trivial. Use something like Lodash to help you, I suppose. So the real thing that you want to use RxJS for, you can use it for a lot of things, because I showed that you can iterate over arrays synchronously and do other stuff with RxJS. But the real thing that it's made for is kind of composing asynchrony. So you've got this set of operations you can perform on asynchronous things, which mean you can kind of query events like a database if you want. And combine different sets of events and that sort of thing. So composing events together, asynchronous things, is really what RxJS is made for. RxJS can be used everywhere. I have personally used RxJS in every one of these things except for Vue. Well, that's not even true. I helped the Vue community with their RxJS helper library, but yeah, it's if you use Slack, if you use a PlayStation 4, if you use a smart TV, which has Netflix on it, like your RxJS is running somewhere in that. So it can run on pretty much any runtime. It's not just for Angular. But this is obviously an Angular meetup, and this talk is about doing some stuff in Angular. So I was just talking about how observables require subscription, and you end up having to kind of manage that subscription object when it comes back, so you can call unsubscribe later. Otherwise, you could end up with some weird memory leaks. But in Angular, we have this pipe async helper, and pipe async is very useful because what it does is it subscribes to the observable for you, takes the values that are emitted, and then binds them out to the view in this one spot. And an interesting thing about this is if you show or hide that spot in the template, when it's shown, it's going to subscribe, and when you hide it, it's going to unsubscribe for you. Same thing with when the component is initialized or when it's destroyed. It automatically will subscribe and unsubscribe if you've got this pipe async in there. But that causes subscription via the same mechanism kind of under the hood. I have an RxJS basics talk. If you want to watch a much fatter version of me talk about RxJS, I will send out the slides later on Twitter. But this kind of goes over basic error handling and some other interesting stuff. But here's the app that I want to update. It's the world's greatest newsfeed app, right? just a list of data that I'm getting that's randomly generated and just displayed to a screen. Like it's a fake newsfeed essentially. What we want to do is we want to add an auto refresh feature to it. So just after a delay, we want to add. We want to have it automatically refresh the data. And then, more interestingly, we want to add like a drag down to reload, right? So people have the refresh things, like you see it in browsers sometimes, or you see it in like native apps. So if you were to have like a PWA or something like that with this Angular, and you really want to be able to do the drag down to refresh, you need to coordinate some kind of interesting things to get this done. So I'm going to show that later. It's interesting because there's animations and there's loading and user interaction, that sort of thing. You have to compose them together. So the basic structure of our existing app is just two things. We've got a newsfeed service and we've got a latest news component. It's the simplest Angular app that I could conceive and still update. So our latest news component looks like this. We've got our news. We're injecting our news service feed, or our news feed service rather, and we also have an existing property on there, which is the observable of like the news feed values. So this observable, when you call it, will go get the news feed data and bring it back and resolve, and you get it. So I'll show that in just a second. So again, just to focus on this is the important part, just to get rid of the imports at the top. We've got our news $ property, which we're going to bind out to the view here. So our ng4, you see I'm doing a pipe async on our news $ property. And what that's going to do is subscribe to that news property, and every time it emits a value, which is an array of news, it's going to loop over it with ng4 and then bind the data out to the view, which has the title and the timestamp and some other things. Our newsfeed service is pretty dead simple. It's just a class with a property on it. I could inject the property directly with like a token. I think it just kind of muddied up the example, so I chose to put it on a property of this class. But the property is an observable, and the reason the property is an observable, not a function that returns an observable, is because observables are essentially functions. They don't do anything until you subscribe to them. So wrapping this in a function with no arguments would just be like having a function that returned a function with no arguments. It doesn't make any sense. So it's just a property. And every time you subscribe to that observable, what it's going to do is it's going to use Angular's HTTP client to get the news feed, do a little bit of mapping. This code's kind of old, actually. And then it has some error handling in there. And in this case, the error handling just has a side effect of logging to console. here you might actually display something to the user or something. That would be a feature you could add with a side effect. But it's returning empty, which is just an observable of nothing. We're just kind of saying, hey, I've handled this. You don't need to do anything else. Continue on. And we're also sharing. And this is important because that means everyone that subscribes to this news observable, as it's out and doing its thing, will share the underlying request. So you don't make multiple requests every time someone subscribes to it. So again, it's just a basic news feed. That was the entire app. I just explained it in a few minutes. But we need to add the update interval feature. So I'm going to start off by refactoring the newsfeed service a bit, because right now it's pretty simple. All that happens when you subscribe to news is you just get this observable, basically like an already initialized get, HTTP client get observable that is doing some other stuff. Oops, where did I go? Yeah. So what I want to do to update this is I'm going to go and I'm going to say, all right, instead of news being going directly to our HTTP client get, I'm going to have news come from refresh, which is a behavior subject. Now, subjects are this thing inside of RxJS where you can call next on it, and it causes the subject, which is an observable itself, to emit a value. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say what was news $, which is the HTTP get, is a property called load news, and every single time someone calls next into refresh, I'm going to map that into load news and subscribe to it and wait for that to come back. I don't expect everyone to follow this. Again, I'm just doing this to kind of show some of the powerful things you can do with RxJS. So, and then on this side, what we need to do is we're going to add a refresh timer. In fact, if we did nothing right now, the app still works the way it did. But we want to add a refresh timer. And the reason the app still works the way it did is a behavior subject, when you first subscribe to it, gives you like an initial emission of some value. So that causes the news feed to originally load. But if I add a refresh timer here, which I'm doing with timer, which is a helper function that comes from RxJS, timer, what it does is it says, if you give it 0 and then a second numeric argument, it says emit the first value at 0 milliseconds and then have an interval every 30, in this case 30 seconds. That's going to emit a new value. So it's 0, and then 1, and then 2, and so on. We don't really care too much about the actual numbers that come out of the timer, but we're going to use the refresh timer to force the news feed to refresh. And in order to do this, I'm actually going to have to manually subscribe in this case. So I'm going to, at least in this particular implementation, that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to say, I'm going to add on init. And I'm going to say when the component mounts, so on init, I'm going to subscribe to the refresh timer and pump the value straight into refresh, which is our behavior subject. So every time refresh timer emits, refresh is going to get notified of like, hey, go do this. And then refresh triggers load news, and then we get our news data. So this is all I really needed to do to update that. The other thing that I want to do too is I've captured the subscription. I don't want that timer to keep going forever after my component is destroyed. I need to clean that up. So I've captured my subscription in a property. I need to add the property to make TypeScript happy, and then I add an ng on destroy at the bottom that has the unsubscribe in it. Right. So when the component unmounts or when it's destroyed, we're going to call unsubscribe on the subscription and stop the timer. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell. So just to recap before I show it working, because I've got a little video of it working. We use a behavior subject to kind of reactively trigger the reload. So now if we have our newsfeed service and we call next on that refresh, it's going to tell whoever subscribed to that news observable, they're going to get new news at whenever it comes back. Our latest news component, we added a timer to it and we nexted into that behavior subject. And then we also had to manage our subscription with onInit and onDestroy. If anybody here uses React or Ember or another framework, so like in React you would use, instead of onInit and onDestroy, it would be component did mount and component will unmount. It's the same exact, it's like did mount and will unmount in Ember. It's the same exact sort of mechanism. It works the same across any framework. So now I've got this, I changed it to 3 seconds, so now I've got this thing. Is it playing? Yes. And it refreshes every 3 seconds or so. So that was the whole feature that I wanted. I would change it to like 30 seconds or something later, or a minute or something that wasn't so spammy, but that's the basic idea. So you might notice we didn't touch the template the entire time I did that. The refactor was pretty small, even though it took a while to explain. And what we really kind of did is we worked backwards. So I started with saying, hey, I need to, I have this HTTP thing that's like the minimal thing. I need to make something else that kind of feeds into that in order to get that to update on demand. And then I need something to feed into that, and so on. So I've kind of worked my way backwards to the chain. It's harder to see in this example because we didn't do as much. But we're going to see it more in the pull down to reload feature. So the reason that this is the example I chose is because it's got a lot of stuff to coordinate. It's not a feature most people would ever need to add. It's not even maybe a good feature to add, I don't know. But it's a feature that has a lot of things to coordinate. You have to deal with user touch events, right? So you start when the user touches. You track their downward pull with some sort of icon, right? So you have to move the icon when they're pulling down. And you want to have the icon start spinning if they get past a certain point and trigger a reload. And then when the reload's done, which has nothing to do with what their finger's doing, you want to animate that thing back up to where it was, but not have what their finger's doing interfere with that, right? If they don't pull it down far enough and they let go, it's got to animate back up to where it was. So there's a lot of stuff to kind of coordinate with this. And you also have the animation, which itself could be an observable. You can make animations with the observable. I actually did in this example, but I don't dive into animations because that would be a whole separate 30-minute long talk probably of how to make animations with Rx. But so again, there's just a lot to coordinate. There's 3 different touch events. There's Ajax that we have to know when it starts and when it completes. And you also have to deal with animations. And you have to kind of get all these things working together. So I'm going to do this by creating a few things. I'm going to add a touch drag to load component. And this is going to be responsible for controlling that drag icon that's going to follow my finger. It has to emit some events. Also, it's going to have to say, hey, I want to reload because I've gone past this particular point. It's got to deal with coordinating all those touch events and animating that icon. I also will end up needing to refactor the latest news component because I need to include that new touch drag to load component. And then I also need to wire up the event to next into the newsfeed service to get new values in there. That was a horrible slip of the tongue. All right, sorry about that. So our touch drag to load component, just to start off, I've added an output here for the refresh events. So this is going to be when you drag past a certain point, we're going to send an event out of this event emitter. So whoever's consuming it knows, hey, someone's dragged past a certain point and I need to do a thing. The actual HTML, and this is just straight HTML at this point, I'm not doing anything dynamic, looks like this. I've got an outer div to kind of deal with centering the stuff. I've got an inner div, which I'm actually going to dynamically change that it's dealing with moving the icon down in a vertical manner. I've got an SVG, which I've got a transform on that I'm going to change dynamically to rotate the icon. And then I've got the actual icon as a pair of circles that are one's kind of off-center from the other, so you can see that it's spinning. I've got my latest news component here. I'm going to need to add that touch drag to refresh. And all I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to have this refresh event next into newsfeed service refresh. I could have it call back to a method. It might make it more testable. But for sake of simplicity for this example, I'm just saying, hey, every time I get a refresh event from this component, call next on refresh. And we know that triggers the newsfeed data to reload, which is already bound to our component here. So now we can see it just kind of sitting there. And things will be refreshing in the background. But that doesn't do anything. It's just like, here's a circle. Congratulations. So we need to kind of let's get this thing kind of like animating or moving. First, I'm going to make this whole thing dynamic. So I'm taking the same HTML and I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to dynamically change style transform on that inner div with this transform positions observable, right? So I'm subscribing to an observable called transform positions that I'm going to get that string from and put it in there. Same thing with the transform on the SVG, only I'm calling it transform rotate. So this is going to get that rotation string. And then on the component, I add the simplest possible observable I can add to make it work. So this is just an observable of the exact same strings I just pulled out of the HTML, right? Because I'm working my way backwards. I'm going to totally replace these in a bit. But right now, I just want to make sure it works. So I put that in there, and it should be fine. However, I know that I want to deal with numbers and not strings because I'm going to do some manipulation of where it's at. So I'm going to make transform positions derived from another property called positions, which is now just an observable of 0. The simplest possible thing, and it's going to map that 0 into the string that we had there before, right? So it's saying, here's a 0, now 0 equals translate 3D negative 35px, 0px. The negative 35px, by the way, is because our circle is 70 pixels in height. So it's kind of offsetting it. And then I'm going to do the same thing for transform rotate. I'm going to have it derived from an observable of number. Also, simplest possible thing is observable of 0. And then if I look at it, it looks exactly the same. Not exciting, but this is being dynamically produced at this point from an observable. So I'm gonna add a slight tweak to this so we can move the marker off the screen. Again, that marker is 70 pixels in diameter. So just to shove it off, we subtract 70 from the Y position and it's off the top. And now let's make touch drags affect the position. Earlier, I showed mouse downs. So the mouse version of like drag and drop, right? So it's, again, mouse downs, and for every mouse down, you map that into an observable of all mouse movements, but you take those until mouse up, and you subscribe to that. So this ends up being an observable of mouse movement events that only happens while your finger's on there. Or in this case, when your mouse is clicked. So we're going to do the same thing only with touch, and I'm going to use RxJS's helper from event for this because I care about the events in the entire document. There are ways to hook this in Angular. I think this is more straightforward. You can do it however you like, but at the end of the day, each one of these from event document touch start, that just makes an observable of touch start events, or an observable of touch move events, or an observable of touch end events. And the pattern is exactly the same. For every touch start, give me all the touch moves and take those until a touch end event, right? And this is really rudimentary. You might have to do other things with touch because you can touch more than once and let go more than once. So if you look at this example and you try to use it directly, this is kind of just a basic example so as not to melt people's heads about those sorts of things, but Rx can handle that too. And then I'm just going to take that and I'm going to add that directly to my touch drag to load component. So now I've got these 4 new properties. I've got touch start, touch move, and touch end. Touch end should probably be capitalized on the one line. And then I've got this touch drags, which is derived from those others. And again, every one of these things is just an observable. We're going to need to subscribe to them to make them do anything. But remember before I had this positions observable that was just an observable of 0. I'm going to make that now come straight from touch drags. And so touch drags, though, we need it to be an observable of like Y position, so an observable of number. And right now, it's an observable of touch events, right? So that those aren't numbers. So in order to get that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a map into the touch move step. And basically, I'm going to say for every, I'm just looking at the first touch in this case, whatever the Y position is for the current touch movement, I'm going to subtract the Y position for wherever I started from the touch start event, right? So I get like a diff of like how far down I've drug. And just to focus on that a little bit, I took some of the stuff off the outside. The other thing I did is you'll see down at the bottom, I'm adding a start with on positions because I want to start at 0. And I'm not starting with anything if I'm waiting for a touch event, right? So I wanted to start at 0 so it starts off the screen. So now, if I do this, it moves with touch. Doesn't do anything else, but movement's exciting, right? I personally get a kick out of doing anything that involves animation or like moving things. because so often you're just like, I've got data in a database. Now I've got data on a screen. Now I'm putting data back in the database. You don't get to do any of the fun stuff, right? So let's make it animate home when we let go. I have an RxJS animations talk that I gave. Again, it's a whole talk. I don't really want to do any more than 2 talks today. So there's a video of this with a thinner me that is dressed very fancy, talking about how I do animations. The long story short, animations are basically you take an observable of animation frames and then math, and then you get this, every animation frame you get a diff, like a number change over a certain duration. So it's a fun talk. I like doing that one in particular because animations are fun. So the short version is that I have this animation service that has an interface that looks like this. It's got a tween method on it that takes a number that you want to start with and a number you want to end on and a duration. And it triggers a bunch of animation frames. And the first value it emits is the start number. And then over the duration, it does some math to figure out how far into your duration it is. And it gives you values between the start and the end number. Everyone can get that. So back to this. What I need to do is I'm going to focus on altering touch drags now because I know that's feeding into my positions. And I'm going to say, all right, I'm adding this new property called move home because I'm going to probably have to use this more than once. And this is just saying, use the animation service tween from some position that I'm storing in state. Some people will say, this isn't the purest version of Rx ever. I don't care. If it's readable and it's maintainable, fine. I can see there's a private member named underscore POS there. That's fine. That's what we're going to use. So from wherever POS is to 0 in 0.2 seconds, that's our animation. It's just numbers that we're getting. So from POS to 0. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, hey, take the mouse movements, and whenever mouse movements is done, so it's because we're taking that until touch end, so whenever the touch is over, I'm going to add move home right after it with concat. So I'm going to concatenate the move home observable to right after the touch movements observable is done. And it's only done when I let go with touch, right? So as soon as I let go, it's gonna play this move home animation, and those numbers are going to feed out of touch drags, exactly the same. But there is one weird problem. POS is always 0, right? So we need to do something to update that. So there's a side effect operator called tap, and that just says, hey, whatever number you have right here, I want you to set underscore POS with it. So it's just kind of tapping into what value is in the observable at that point, and has the side effect of updating underscore POS. But there's one more weird problem, which is whenever move home is created, which happens when you construct the observable, POS is always 0. So your animation, your tween, will always be between 0 and 0, always, every time you subscribe to it. So I need to delay the creation of that animation's tween. And RxJS has a helper method for this called defer. And what defer is defer just says, here's a function that when you subscribe to the observable you get back from defer, I want you to execute this function and subscribe to whatever observable it returns. So it's just deferring the creation of an observable to later on. So now this should work just fine. So when I drag down and I lift, it animates back. Which, I mean, that's exciting. Now it's doing things on its own, right? It's not always good with your code when it does things on its own, but in this case, it's good. So let's make it refresh the feed if you get far enough. So we've got it animating back. We've got it following our finger. But if we drag far enough, we want it to animate back. So I'm going to go back and look at our touch drags. And I'm going to add something to touch drags, which is after the exhaust map, I'm going to add another tap. And really, because this is another place for a side effect, because I want to emit an event from my refresh event on this component, right? Which we already wired up to refresh on our news service in our other template, and that's going to go trigger the data reload. So this is just saying, hey, if y gets past half the inner height of the window, then I want you to call emit. And it's for every single value of y that makes it that far, right? So if I drag them all over here, it's gonna emit a whole bunch of times. We don't want that. So I'm gonna add one more thing, which is take while. So we only want to take the values until they get past the window inner height. If you get past that, then this whole observable now is going to stop, the entire thing. Which means our drag stuff isn't going to work anymore too. But we can watch, let's see. So there's a first drag and it animates back. The second drag, I pull it down and it does refresh the data, which is exciting, but then the touch doesn't work anymore because I've killed the entire observable with that take while at the end. So what do we do? Oh my gosh. Well, I'll tell you what, well, I think I'll do that next. Right now, let's just have it go home after the load is finished. We'll complete the entire load segment first. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. I was excited. So what I'm going to focus on now is I'm going to focus on this positions thing. And I need to update positions now with an additional animation that only occurs when the newsfeed gets its new data back. So I'm going to add this property called move home after load. And basically, I'm just going to say, hey, every time load news resolves on my newsfeed service, I want to map that into move home and play that till it's done. Right? Because that already exists. Newsfeed service load news is a shared observable of those HTTP results when they come back. And then I'm going to make positions come from position updates now instead of just touch drags. So that's just going to concat, hey, take all the touch drags until it ends. And then as soon as it ends, let's move home after the load. So it's going to play that animation right afterwards. And then I just change this to come from position updates instead of touch drags, the positions there. So now we get to where it loads the data and then it animates back. But it only works one time, and you can't drag it anymore because the whole observable chain has died. Because it played through the take while, and then we played through the animation, and that's it. Because that's the end of the concat chain, right? So this is actually a really easy fix. What we do is we just add repeat on the end of our concatenation there. And now what that does is say, hey, do this touch drag thing until you drag past half the distance of the height of the window, and then play the home then wait to play the home animation until the data comes back, right? And then you're done, but wait, repeat. Okay, go up and do the touch drag thing again. So it just resubscribes to that, and it waits for that to be done, and then it moves on to the move home after reload. So now it works, and it goes back. But as the text says, it's boring if it doesn't spin. That's my opinion. I think it's boring when it doesn't spin. So let's make it spin. We have this. We might have forgotten about this so far. We have this property of just a rotate of 0. That's obviously what we're going to be messing with. Probably not the transform one underneath. It's just the string manipulation part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tween again, and I'm going to say, hey, let's make this tween between 0 and 360. So for those of you that have forgotten geometry or trig or whatever, that's 360 degrees all the way around a circle. And that's going to make it go all the way around once in half a second. And to make it continuously go around, we just added our friend repeat again, which we're already using elsewhere. So now, if you subscribe to this and you were to pump those values through this rotate here, it's going to, well, it's already going through rotate. If you were to subscribe to this, it's just going to spin continuously. And since we've already subscribed to it in the template, now when we pull it down, it's always spinning, like always. Which, I don't know, maybe you want that feature on. It's kind of cool. But we really want to restrict the spinning to only while the data is loading. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to change this a bit, and I'm going to say, hey, every single time that newsfeed refresh gets a value nexted into it, this is the same subject that I'm using to trigger my reloads, right? So every time someone calls next on refresh, which says, hey, go start loading the data, I'm also going to trigger the animation. And then I'm going to take that until the data comes back from load news. But I want to end with 0 so it doesn't end up in some weird cockeyed position, right? Like we want to put it back to where it belongs. So let's see. That's it. That's our entire feature. We've got our drag down to reload. Follows your finger, it spins. It's all fun. Your team's going to be so happy when you add this feature. So the important thing, so I talked a lot about all this, but really this entire behavior that we added was like about 50 lines of code, right? You can do this with imperative code. Good luck at getting it. But the trade-off here is obviously things around readability. There's ways to improve that that I didn't do, mostly for the simplicity of just showing the using of the operators here. But at the end of the day, you're shipping a lot less code. It's code that's being reused. Most of the stuff is used in other parts of Angular, like in the router and those sorts of things. So it's not adding a lot of size to your bundle. And you have this pretty cool feature for not a lot of additional coding on your part. So again, the summary for this talk is that RxJS is really best at coordinating events. So you can use it for a lot of other interesting things. You want to work your way backwards. So start like bind something out to your view. Start with the minimal observable that like will make your view look right, and then go through and figure out, okay, well, what other observables do I need to feed into that one, and how do I transform those into the right shape? So a lot of RxJS is about scrubbing data in observables to the shape that you need. And if you ever need to create an observable dynamically, like say you add some property and you're like, oh crap, there's this weird thing happening where I create an observable and the value for it doesn't exist until after the component mounts or something, you can wrap it in defer and voila, magic, it works. Defer is a pretty small bit of code, actually, too. There's this pattern with take while and repeat. So sometimes you'll build a whole observable chain out and it'll be like, oh, I got this thing coordinating all the things we want, but I had to do this take while at the end. And the whole thing dies after the take while, and what do I do? And a lot of people don't realize you just add repeat and it starts the whole process over again. So that's an interesting pattern. And then the other thing you want to do that I did through this, and I didn't really talk about it too much, is you try to factor out your observables into other properties on your component, because it will make it easier to test in some cases. In Angular, you might even want to move some of them off to their own services and stuff so you can inject them. But that's it in a nutshell. So again, the demo repo actually exists for this. You can go out and look at it. I'll send these slides out. You can follow me on Twitter. I think I've successfully answered every question anyone's ever sent me on Twitter, but it does take me a while. And this varies. I get questions all the way from, how do I become a good developer? And it's like, I don't know, to more specific questions about RxJS or Angular. Okay, so the question was, he's using UI router. I'm just saying this for people that are streaming. He's using UI router, so Angular 1, right? Angular 2, UI router. I haven't played with that too much, but if you have a promise from any library, and you need to convert it to an observable, there's a lot of things about RxJS where you can take pretty much, and I'm going to bring up StackBlitz here, but you can take pretty much any promise or any operator that accepts an observable, and you can just return a promise in there and it'll just work. If you need to convert it straight up to an observable, you can use from. So like if I wanted, I don't know if everyone can see this or not. Is it big enough? Maybe. Sure, why not? So I bring in, not from event pattern, from, and I've got some promise up above here. Right? I can literally just take this and say from, and it'll work. See, I get high out of that. So converting a promise to an observable is just as simple as using from. From you can also use to convert arrays, iterables, anything any set that can be converted to an observable. Now, another thing that people don't realize is if I've got, say, like a merge map or something in here, and I'm going from of 1, 2, 3 type merge map, and then I've got this promise in there, I can just as easily return the promise again, right? Oops, typo. But and you see you get all three results for the promise out of there. So pretty much any API inside of RxJS where you can return an observable, you can also return a promise or an array or an iterable. Having worked on this mostly outside of work as an unpaid volunteer for the last 3 years, I can tell you that part of my pay for being an open source contributor is hearing people complain about the library and how much it sucks. The complaints usually are that it's very complicated, or they don't understand it, that sort of thing, or it's harder to read. A lot of the readability just comes from understanding. So one thing that people need to realize is all of these operators are really like a domain-specific language for dealing with sets of events, right? It's just like learning, what left join and right join and whatever mean in SQL. It's the same thing as learning what switch map and merge map, and not that those are the same exact idea, but you get the idea. It's a specific vernacular around dealing with sets of events. And people, when confronted with RxJS, they think, well, this is JavaScript, and I know JavaScript. Therefore, I should know every word that's on my screen and what it means. And it's just not true. You end up needing to learn a bit about how RxJS works in order to kind of understand, or at least learn some of those common pieces. I think that the documentation needs a lot of work, and there is a lot of work being done around that right now. But it's all mostly volunteer work, so it moves pretty slow. But that's the primary complaints are usually around documentation and complexity. Not very many complaints about size, not very many complaints about speed. Usually it's just the complexity side of it. The other thing to know too is if you have RxJS and you're just starting using it, you don't need to use all the operators. Like you don't. You can just subscribe to it, get values out, and then do whatever you were normally going to do with it. There's literally nothing wrong with that. And you can build your understanding as you go along. You don't need to dive in and know all 60 operators. I couldn't name them all right now if I had to, and I wrote almost all of them. So I think that with the docs, what we really need to do is kind of get a set of operators that are like the most common ones that people end up using. I know that there's already blogs that have done some of these things. But just kind of start simple and build your way up. Not that that's your problem. That's just what people say sucks about Rx. There's also the flip side too. Sorry, there's the flip side where someone will get someone on their team who gets really excited about RxJS because it is kind of like everything's the same shape like Legos, and I can put things together, and it's so great. And so they'll get someone on their team that's just like, I'm going to Rx everything. And then everyone else in the team is like, I hate the code base that we work on. I don't understand it anymore. I hate this other teammate, and that Lesh guy sucks. So that happens too. I've heard that. So please don't RxJS all the things until your team understands it at least. So the question, just to repeat it for people that are streaming, was about the TC39 proposal for observables. It's stuck in limbo. It's still at stage 1. It doesn't currently have a champion. Jafar Hussain, who's a good friend of mine that I worked with at Netflix, no longer works at Netflix, and therefore is no longer championing the observable proposal. So it's kind of sitting there without a champion right now. I just talked to Miles Borns about that earlier today, and someone might pick it up. It just depends on bandwidth, but it's definitely something where the TC39 they need to either have someone drive it home and decide they don't want to do it, or whatever. But the decision needs to be made on it. There's also a WhatWig proposal to add observables to the DOM in basically anywhere there'd be an event target, which is anything with add event listener, remove event listener. There would be an on method that you could say like on click, and you get back an observable of click events sort of thing. So there was some excitement around that. The Chrome team really liked it, but we would need one more implementer to want to adopt it. And again, it's a bandwidth thing. So there's not enough manpower to kind of champion some of those things to get them through. Well, that's the story. The story is it's stalled. It's stuck in the mud. Not forgotten, but definitely stuck in the mud. The difference between pipe and map. Okay, so pipe is this kooky function. I'm going to kind of go over that in my next talk, but basically pipe is a functional thing that says, hey, you can pass these functional operators to it, and it's going to apply those operators to the observable in order. So map is an operator. So map is this function that returns a function that then gets piped over the observable. So it takes the observable, passes it to the result of map, and then passes it to the result of the next thing under pipe, and the next thing under pipe, and so on. And you end up with a new observable. So map is an operator, pipe is a method on observable. As long as your code is readable and maintainable and it works, you're not doing anything wrong, period. That's the beginning and the end of the story with all programming for all time. Now, as far as like the primary use case for subjects when this whole system was designed is for multicasting. So you get this, you get like the observer pattern, which is like a pattern from the Gang of Four books or whatever, and it has an observer and a subject. And what the subject is responsible for is it's got an add observer and remove observer method on it, and then it's got like a notify method that notifies the observers that you've added or removed from it. So the subject in Rx is no different. And what he does is when you subscribe with functions or an observer, it scrubs it into observer, puts it in an internal list, and then when you next on it, or error on it, or complete on it, it broadcasts that to all the observers in its internal list. So it's of course also an observer on the other side. It has the same shape. So you can use it to subscribe to an observable. So the use case with it is you take an observable, you subscribe to it with a subject, and then everyone that subscribes to the subject gets all the values from that observable, but only one subscription to that observable. So that's the general use cases for multicasting. However, the other use case for it is in situations like, oh, I need to get a value from a click event or from an event in a template. And you don't really have like, oh, I can go wrap this with from event or something like that to make an observable out of it. I think that in the not so distant future after Ivy's done with Angular, you're going to see more features added to Angular around creating observables, cold observables for user events instead of having to pump them through subjects. So things like that are going to be very helpful, and you're going to see fewer subjects show up in your code. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you use a behavior subject, like I did here, if you use a behavior subject for something, I mean, in all honesty, it's not that bad. I think that in the academic sense, like which a lot of the stuff that was written about RxJS before I was ever involved was very academic. In the academic sense, you're not really supposed to do that. You're also not supposed to have side effects that write things to underscore POS and that sort of thing. But guess what? The code's way more readable when I do that, and it works. So again, it's about what works for you, what's readable, what's maintainable. Don't feel guilty. In this case, I wanted that initial value, but I didn't care what the values are because I'm not nexting anything in particular through it, so I just put null in there. So here I wanted the behavior subject because I wanted an initial value, and replay subject doesn't have an initial value, and I would have had to next into the replay subject as soon as the component mounted or something to get it to work. So yeah, there's nothing like super bad about that. I could have nexted something more useful, but null seemed fine. Why allocate anything if I don't have to? Other than a pointer, I suppose. All right, so if I was going to do something other than set that variable on the side, I would probably end up using some sort of scan or merge scan. And the scan operators have internal state. That every time you emit it, you map into new state, it emits the new state, and then it stores it, right? So you'd end up using something like that. In this particular case, I played with that, and I thought it made the code a little bit too confusing for the talk. But yeah, generally speaking, when you need to manage state with Rx, you'd use scan. There's other fancier ones like merge scan and that sort of thing, but scan is the main go-to, which effectively works kind of like a Redux style store. One of the things about trying to keep everything Rxy and keep everything pure and keep everything contained within these streams, not like and limit side effects to where you absolutely need them, is generally side effects or shared state is the source of most bugs in software. It really is, because like more than one process can write to the thing, and then in this case, I could clearly see in a relatively small component that only one thing was writing to it. If you find yourself writing code where all of a sudden multiple things were writing to underscore POS, you should refactor that. You shouldn't, because here it was very obvious what was happening. But as soon as you get multiple things writing to underscore POS, even if it's two things, then it's no longer obvious what's going on with that. So, yeah, that was a good question.